Hey, I'm Ryan Grimm. This is Drop Site News. Today, we're going to be talking about the implications of the election, both at home and abroad. With me is most of the people at Drop Site News. We've got Nosca Renner, Sharif Abdel Qaddous, we've got Jose Olivares, we've got Jeremy Scahill, Murtaza Hussein, and the newest member of the Drop Site team, Jessica Burbank. Welcome, everybody.
All right. Good to be here.
So let's start with overseas, since that's been the focus of so much of our coverage over the last 3 months. And Sharif, let's start with you. What has been the initial reaction to Trump's victory from resistance groups in the region?
Well, I mean, Hamas put out a statement immediately following Trump's win, saying that their position vis-a-vis the new administration will depend on their policies and actions, but it then went very quickly to note that all successive U.S. administrations since the occupation of Palestine in 1948 have supported the Zionist project, have been against the Palestinian cause, have provided diplomatic cover, military support to Israel. And they just went on to call for what they termed a blind bias towards Israel and to end Israel's aggression against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and also against Lebanon. And they also they said the president-elect should heed the voices of American people that have risen up over the past year in opposition to Israel's war on Gaza. So, I think they're noting what most people know, that successive Republican and Democratic administrations, there's kind of a consensus in Washington for support for Israel. We also saw Naim Qassem, who was appointed Secretary General of Hezbollah following Israel's assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. He gave a speech on election day where it wasn't really responding to the election, but he did say that Hezbollah does not consider American elections in their policies. They called American elections worthless, and said that they only consider the battlefield and that they're going to confront Israel on the battlefield. They'll prevent Israel from achieving its goals there, saying very pointedly Hezbollah has tens of thousands of trained fighters who can confront Israeli forces in the long term. And we saw similar statements from other groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and elsewhere. And so, I think when we think about a Trump administration's policies in the Middle East, especially with regard to Palestine, we can look to what he did in his first administration. And he surrounded himself by hardcore pro-Zionist, pro-Israel people, moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. That took place during the weekly Great Marches of Return that were happening in Gaza, a grassroots unarmed movement. Israel responded by lining up snipers and picking people off. And that day, when they were clinking champagne glasses in Jerusalem as they moved the embassy, was the most violent day of the return marches. Israeli snipers shooting over 1,300 Palestinians in Gaza on that day and killing over 60. But Trump also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which it's illegally occupied since 1967. His administration also brokered the so-called Abraham Accords, where you had Arab countries, most notably the United Arab Emirates, but also Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, all normalizing relations with Israel and essentially abandoning the Palestinian cause. And then you also had Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in 2019, saying that the U.S. would no longer view Israeli settlements in the West Bank, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem as inconsistent with international law. That reverses a legal position the U.S. has held since 1978. But that policy was reversed by Antony Blinken in the Biden administration. But of course, this is all symbolic because Israel's never stopped expanding its settlements, and it's never faced any real consequences from any U.S. administration for doing so. So overall, I'd say it's hard to know how the Trump administration could support Israel any more than the Biden administration already has, providing diplomatic cover, funding, and providing a seemingly limitless supply of weapons, without which Israel could not continue this assault on Gaza, on Lebanon, and elsewhere. Israel has not been restrained in any way whatsoever by the Biden administration. Can Trump be worse? Possibly. It's hard to know how, though. It's hard to understand when Israel has been doing exactly what it wants without consequence anyway. And finally, I just say that the prominent historian Rashid Khalidi called Biden the most Zionist US president in history. And Biden openly identifies as a Zionist, and this is clearly ideological for him, given his long history and support for Israel. Trump is more of a wild card. He's surrounded himself in the past with hardcore Zionists and pro-Israel supporters. But Trump, he also hates looking bad. That might prompt some change in policy. But I don't think in any outcome it'll be favorable to Palestinians.
Yep. And Jeremy, Netanyahu, the Israeli government, seemed to start responding to the election before the election even was finished. Election day itself was event-packed in the region. Can you talk a little bit about how Netanyahu's responded to the election itself and now Trump's victory?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that from Netanyahu's perspective, he views Trump as a much preferred alternative to the Democrats on a political level. At the same time, I think there was a bit of a show here. I mean, look, the reality is that for more than 50 years, Joe Biden has a track record of being one of the most open supporters of Israeli action when the Israeli state is at its most violent or most genocidal. And I don't think that there was any actual tension on a policy level between Netanyahu and Biden. I think the Biden administration, when they would issue these leaks about how Biden was frustrated with Netanyahu or was running around swearing about Netanyahu, you're talking about things kind of on the periphery of the narrative. But when it came to the policy itself, there wasn't a thing that Netanyahu wanted that he didn't get from Biden. I think there is a political clash between the two of them, but there's not really a policy clash. When it comes to Trump, it's actually interesting. There was this audio that leaked, and it actually got quite a bit of play. It made the rounds in various listservs that I'm on, where Palestinians primarily are talking about U.S. policy in the region, sharing news articles. There's some indications that Trump kind of views Netanyahu as an annoying little gnat. And doesn't particularly like him. And there's probably all kinds of superficial reasons, that Netanyahu had mustard on his tie or something, and Trump thought it was, disgusting. And then there is, indication that Trump has said positive things about Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, who is widely despised, viewed as corrupt, viewed as a collaborator with the Israelis. But I think that the winner of the U.S. election was clear for a long time, and the winner was going to be Israel. Because either you were going to get Biden, who on a tactical level and a 50-year track record has shown himself to be a militant, staunch defender and promoter of a very violent Israeli state. And on the other hand, if you look at Trump's rhetoric, where he says that, that basically Israel can just annex everything, I think the dominant wisdom in Israel is Trump is going to be much better. I'm not so sure, though, that Trump would have been able to pull off this entire year in the way that Biden did. I would draw an analogy in some ways, Ryan, to what we saw under President Obama coming into power after 8 years of Bush and Cheney. You had the so-called war on terror, this, the world is a battlefield mentality. Obama comes into office and he's briefed by the CIA and the defense establishment and other intelligence agencies, and he really leans heavily into drone warfare as a kind of as Obama characterized it, a smarter way to wage wars, where you don't have a large troop presence, but you're still conducting regular, constant military action. And so, in a sense, Obama was able to expand some of the wars that Cheney and Bush cooked up in their neocon laboratory and sustain them because he legitimized these tactics in the eyes of many liberals. If Trump had been president when October 7th happened, I think you would have seen a lot more mainstream opposition, particularly when you start hitting December and January, and it becomes clear for anyone who is paying any level of attention that this is a war of annihilation. I think we would have seen a different public response. So I would say that there's one other factor, which is that in many ways, Trump is kind of a coward. I wouldn't call Trump a normal person, but I would say that he was not a creature of Washington. And we saw multiple times during Trump's 4 years where he seemed to really be concerned about his reputation if he did action X. And that includes, large-scale killing operations. Yes, Trump used the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. Yes, he expanded drone strikes. Yes, he assassinated Qasem Soleimani. All of those things are true. Trump is not a dove. He is a very militaristic, has a track record as a very militaristic president. On the other hand, he operates with a different sense than Biden, who is a total lifelong creature of Washington. So while I do think that this election was going to produce an ominous result for the Palestinians no matter what, I wouldn't just necessarily assume, Trump would have been worse. I don't think there is a worse. And I think it was a big lie that was told constantly to Palestinians, to Arab Americans, to anyone with a conscience who was opposed to this, that, you think Biden was bad. Just wait till Trump gets his hand on the Gaza policy. The Gaza policy, is destroy all of Gaza, empty out at a minimum the north of Gaza, and leave open the door to Netanyahu to ram through this agenda. So my bottom line is, Trump's going to be an atrocity unleashed on Palestine, and Biden for the past year, or you could say also the past 50 years, has been a horrendous opponent of Palestinian basic rights, liberty, and in fact, life.
And Maz or anybody else who wants to respond to this, what do you make of Netanyahu's personnel moves, his firing of Yoav Gallant, and also their willingness to kind of explicitly announce the successful ethnic cleansing of northern Gaza? To Jeremy's point, on election day they put out a statement saying, "Okay, the north is now cleared. We're not letting anybody back in, and therefore we're not going to allow any humanitarian aid in." Of course, it's not true that is cleared, but it's clear what they're saying about it. They also talk about him firing other cabinet secretaries, chief of staff, et cetera, and consolidating power. What are we to draw from those moves?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Sharif and Jeremy that Biden effectively maxed out the level of hostility to Palestinians that was possible. And had Trump been in office in this time, there wouldn't have been that much of a material difference, or maybe any material difference at all. I think the crucial thing now is there are 2 months left before a new administration comes into power, and it's an opportunity to shape the environment for Trump such that Netanyahu can narrow down the scale of options Trump has, or shape the circumstances Trump has to face when he's in office. So you mentioned the ethnic cleansing of north of Gaza. One thing Trump may do is further indulge and further encourage the settler agenda in Israel and the extreme right agenda, of which he was a great friend before. A part of that agenda is settling Gaza again, too. It's something on the table. His former ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, just published a book essentially laying out a plan for permanent apartheid in the whole West Bank as well. He could help that along, too. So I think that all these things are likely. A Palestinian friend actually said something very funny to me. It was kind of darkly funny. He said that, the difference between Trump and Biden is the difference between sending 4 bulldozers to bulldoze your house and 6. So it's maybe not really much of a difference, maybe a little faster, but it's the end result is effectively the same. I do think one thing that's very, very important to watch now is the policy towards Iran, because the biggest goal of the Netanyahu government...
Although before we get to that, Sharif, we were just pointing out that they're somewhat trying to walk back or clarify this claim about northern Gaza, and then let's get to Iran, because Maz, you had a good story on that this week. At Drop Site.
Yeah, I mean, the point still stands of what they've actually done in northern Gaza, which is to essentially ethnically cleanse it to a degree we haven't seen in this genocidal assault on Israel. But there was a brigadier general who was widely quoted, saying that they've completed or gotten closer to the complete evacuation of northern Gaza. And more importantly, that residents will not be allowed to return home. Of course, residents haven't been, anyone who crosses the Netzarim corridor hasn't been allowed back. So that is a de facto policy, but this was the first time it was openly stated in this way, which is like a very grave violation of international law. And so we're now seeing the Israeli military spokespeople trying to walk this comment back. But the policy on the ground, I think, is clear.
Yeah. So let's talk about Iran. I was talking to a few MAGA types on the night of the election and the day after, and they were saying that, and so this is from their perspective, saying that Iran is kind of what they called a blind spot from Trump, and they are thinking of Trump as genuinely serious about peace in the region, but from their perspective, Iran is a blind spot. Partly, he appears to believe some of the reports that Iran was plotting to kill him in retaliation for him killing Qasem Soleimani, and otherwise, I think he has some close friendships with Gulf figures over the years. I think who have so he's got both the Gulf figures plus his pro-Israel allies who have been bad mouthing Iran to him for decades, and so might be a little bit more ingrained. So Maz, talk a little about your report on Brian Hook, what's his name? Mehdi and I wrote about this guy back in 2018 when we got a leaked copy of this paper he wrote saying that U.S. policy ought to be to call for an Islamic reformation. This is a guy who in 2016 was telling people he could never stomach working for Trump because he's such a retrograde degenerate. 2 years later, he's working for him, and now next term he's running his transition.
Well, this has kind of been the irony of Trump, at least to date, that he has sometimes vocalized these very anti-establishment sentiments in foreign policy, but then he's gone and appointed these very, very establishment-type people to his administration. Brian Hook was a point man on Iran under Mike Pompeo during the Trump State Department. So he is now supposedly helping select the personnel for the new Trump State Department. And you can imagine he's a super hawkish person on Iran. He will likely appoint people who share that perspective. And the timing is very, very volatile, in my opinion, because now for the first time ever, you have Israel and Iran shooting at each other directly, not indirectly through proxies or covert attacks, bombing and firing rockets at each other. And I think that now you have a very, very dangerous situation where the whole message of Trump's people who were hawkish on Iran, and Jared Kushner was one of them as well too, recently in a statement he gave a few weeks ago, has been that Iran is basically a pushover, and Israel revealed that by its campaign against Hezbollah, its other attacks it carried out inside Iran recently. So that's a very compelling message because Trump does not want to get involved in the big, long quagmire in the Middle East. Again, he said so repeatedly, including vis-a-vis Iran. But if it's told to him that it's very easy and you can kind of get away with it, he may be less hesitant to greenlight supporting Israel in such a campaign or even contributing to such a campaign directly. So the Iranian calculation very well may be that they need to show that they're not a pushover now. They need to hit Israel very, very hard, deter them after their last wave of attacks against Iran and show them that they weren't effective. And any war that does happen will be very, very difficult, very, very drawn out and have uncertain consequences. And thereby convince Trump or convince J.D. Vance that this is not something that they want to get involved in because it will be a drain on the resources and time of their administration, which both Vance and Trump have said. So I think a lot of it comes down to who ends up being appointed to the Trump team. The initial signs are not positive, in my opinion, but it's an open question. And I think that the next 2 months will be very, very dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than they've ever been in terms of the relations between Israel and Iran.
And what do we know, and this could be for anybody who has insight into this, what do we know about Iran's plans to continue to retaliate or to retaliate again? Most of what we were getting seemed to be coming out of leaks from the Israeli government, but is Iran going to strike again? Or?
They've said they're planning a very complex and multifaceted retaliation against Israel. They've said that numerous times. They also said it wouldn't happen before the election. So they've repeatedly signaled in very, very unambiguous terms that they're going to do it. And this is, of course, in retaliation for strikes Israel carried out a few weeks ago. And prior to that, Iran had hit Israel with some ballistic missiles as well. They may carry out attacks from inside Iraq. Thereby, the accuracy and range of the missiles could be greater. They can do more damage inside Israel. They may fire more missiles. They may equip stronger warheads. They may equip higher caliber of missiles. It's also been said that the Iranian military itself will be involved as opposed to just the aerospace forces or the IRGC because some Iranian ordinary military members were killed in the Israeli strikes. So I think that I would be very, very surprised based on their statements, given the level to which they've indicated it's coming, that they do not do something before January.
I'll just also add very, very briefly, if we look at that second attack that just happened a few weeks ago by Iran, as we all know, it was a very, very measured and calculated attack, right? They announced, basically, they leaked to US intelligence that it was going to happen. Everyone in Israel got a warning, an alert. Everyone went into bomb shelters. And they just showed how they can overwhelm Israel's system with these missiles. And we had missiles landing in Tel Aviv, We don't exactly know. There isn't enough reporting because there's censorship about what was hit, but it seems hardly anyone was even injured. But this was, I think, a calculated attack. It came in the wake of the assassination of Nasrallah and the ramping up of the war in Lebanon, and it seemed like Israel was just going all out and getting the green light from the US. And so it was just like a warning, slow down, we can overwhelm your system if we want to. And then they walked it back. So it was a very calculated move. And we'll have to see if it spirals further, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the point I was going to make is that the way that the narrative has been set for a long, long time, that is promoted by the U.S., Israel, Britain, basically the entirety of Western imperial power in the world, is that Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, that these are the aggressors, these are the terrorists, these are the people that are trying to wholesale kill civilians and intentionally kill people because they're Jewish and they want the Jewish state wiped off the map. If you look, though, at the actual events that have occurred during the course, particularly of the past year, but also extending far beyond that, Iran has a extensive history, and I would argue that generally speaking, this is true of Hezbollah as well, of really calibrating how they attack Israel. And if Iran or Hezbollah, for that matter, wanted to kill large numbers of Israeli civilians, they have the capacity to do so. And the response from Israel and broader social media in Israel to the Iran attacks was to sort of say, "Ha, your attack failed. You didn't kill any of us." The intent wasn't to kill, and I think it bears repeating that. It's just we have a long enough series of facts to say that there's a pattern there. And, so when the Trump people come into power, if they want to stake out a belligerent position that in part is based on the notion that Iran is unable to inflict actual damage on Israeli society, that is a radical miscalculation. Maz and I have talked about this a lot, looking at and I've been speaking to, people that really understand the munitions capability of the so-called axis of resistance countries and forces. They really haven't used the most sophisticated tactics or weapon systems that they have available to them. And so, there would be quite a bit of wisdom that probably doesn't exist in Trump world at taking that into account and recognizing that, Iran was attacked first by Israel. Israel is constantly attacking Iran in some form or another through assassinations. Iran's initial strikes against Israel some months ago were, in fact, in response to Israel striking the Iranian consulate in Damascus and killing both military figures and civilians alike. So, part of, I think, our job, too, as journalists is to remind people that the dominant narrative is dominant because of how it's been promoted and pushed and who's doing it, but it doesn't make it the true narrative. And, I think it just constantly bears repeating that the aggressors in that region are, in fact, Israel and the United States. And Iran, relative to the attacks Israel has conducted against it, and this is also true of Hezbollah, have been far within the parameters of a rational, proportionate response. And that just isn't often, that point isn't often made enough, but it's journalistic malpractice not to make it.
Right before the last attack by Israel, Iran sent out signals that if they didn't attack the oil fields, didn't attack the nuclear fields, and it was the nuclear facilities, and it was somewhat of a limited attack, that Iran would consider the matter closed. Israel then launched, and was apparently bribed hilariously by the United States. Like, we offered them money if they would not attack the oil fields or the nuclear facilities, and so they finally agreed to do that. And they launched, largely at military targets. They ended up killing, I believe, 4 figures from the Iranian army or some branch of the military, which I know hit hard in Iran, but it still did seem to be something of a limited strike. So what was it about the strike that made Iran say, okay, actually we are going to respond with this complex and aggressive retaliation?
I think the biggest factor is they killed people. They killed 5 people, 4 soldiers, and not IRGC people, members of the Artesh, the regular military, and then 1 civilian was also killed. That is something which maybe Israel is accustomed to doing in neighboring countries that it has this escalation dominance over for some years. But it's nothing that happens in Iran. This has not happened in their relationship. And if it happens now, they've set a new baseline. So now they feel, for this reason, they need to deter this from becoming normal. And I think it's very concerning, actually, because you mentioned that Netanyahu talked about not just hitting the oil facilities, but the nuclear facilities. A lot of the nuclear facilities in Iran, the most sophisticated ones, are built underground or they're built in mountain. And I'm thinking specifically of the Fordo and Natan sites. They're very difficult. They're actually not possible for the Israeli government to destroy with airstrikes unless the U.S. provides 20,000-pound bombs, which Israel does not have. They don't have the aircraft ready there to deploy them. So either the U.S. would have to get involved or something which I think is not an inconceivable outcome at this point at all. Israel may use tactical nuclear weapons to destroy those sites because that's the only way they can do so on their own. So I think that we're heading into a very dangerous situation. As I said, Iran will carry out these attacks. We'll see what happens. Israel may hit the oil sites, and there'll be another cycle of retaliation. And then, as Netanyahu said, his goal ultimately is the nuclear sites, and there's only two ways that can happen.
That's a fascinating point because, right, Israel has killed, probably 4 or 5 civilians in the since we started this podcast, and so maybe they are just so used to that they miscalculated and didn't expect this level of response. But Nauska, go ahead. What were you saying?
I was just going to back up a little bit and think about how we're talking about Trump's foreign policy in general. I mean, I think there's going to be kind of a temptation there's going to be a lot of fuss really within the Republican Party about who's getting appointed. Are they a hawk? Are they an isolationist? Where is Trump's strategy going? And to me, it's just going to be a remix. You're going to have some countries where we're going to take a quote unquote isolationist stance, and then you're going to have countries like Israel and Iran where it seems pretty obvious that there's not going to be much backing down in terms of the U.S. And I just wanted to add, one angle to our conversation, which is that, what that says to me, the mixed strategy of some isolationism, some aggression, it's also so tied up with Trump's corruption. You're cozying up to certain countries and you're cutting out others. And I guess I had a question for you, Ryan, really, which is, you covered Jared Kushner in the first Trump administration and his role. And, after Trump was done, he got $2 billion from a Saudi firm from Saudi Arabia for his investment firm. I just saw a report in Ynet, and it's just one report, so I don't know, that Kushner is actually not planning to join the next Trump administration. Which, to me, I'm wondering, does that mean that he's planning to stay in business? He doesn't actually feel that he needs to influence Israel policy. He's planning to sort of reap the rewards of his father-in-law.
Well, I think his 4 years under his father-in-law were lucrative and were interesting and allowed him to have, outsized influence that he never would have had were it not for just the luck of him winding up in this situation. But I think he also had a really difficult time navigating the corridors of power and not getting charged with crimes of conflict of interest and bribery, etc. He now has this multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that Saudi Arabia pumped money into. So it's not as if he won't be in constant communication with his father-in-law. And I don't think he was even taking the $170,000 White House salary or whatever it was. So he doesn't need direct access in there. At the same time, it's interesting that while the corruption comes into play, for sure, Saudi Arabia is in a different situation than it was before. As he inked the Abraham Accords, they were moving very close to normalization and being direct allies in a confrontation with Iran. And now, and Sharif, Maz, Jeremy may have more insight into now, it's not off the table indefinitely, but Saudi Arabia has been very clear that as long as this genocide is ongoing, they're not going to, and as long as Israel is refusing to even contemplate and pretend that there's going to be a Palestinian state, then they're not going to normalize relations with him, and they're even meeting.
There's not going to be a high-speed rail from Israel to Neom.
No. Instead, they're meeting. They're on friendlier terms with Iran to isolate Israel. So, and which China is helping to broker. So, Kushner that complicates Kushner's situation.
I mean, one thing, and then I'll shut up for a minute. But one thought on this regarding the Abraham Accords. When I spoke to Hamas and Islamic Jihad officials, the Abraham Accords was certainly not the primary motivation for October 7th, but it is always referred to as an area of concern, in the years leading up to the October 7th attacks. And I think that there is a general sense that's existed for decades in the region that these nations, these Arab nations, are completely fine with watching Palestine burn, and that it has not risen to any level necessitating any sort of real response from any Arab nation. I mean, if you look at who has responded in any meaningful way to the genocide in Gaza, you're looking at the axis of resistance countries. Yes, you have diplomatic protests. You've had recalls of ambassadors. You've had, language of warning of consequences. But the reality is that no one expects any Arab nation under the current leadership in those countries to do anything meaningful. However, if those nations now start to make deals with Trump under the framework of the Abraham Accords, I'm thinking particularly of the Saudis, but also, even though Jordan has normalized relations with Israel, and Egypt has, the treaty with Israel, the domestic populations in these countries are ripe for some sort of action. I'm not delusional about the state of affairs. There are authoritarian leaders with secret police that are brutal. But it will be very interesting to watch how the populations of a variety of Arab nations react to moves by their government to circumvent a resolution of the Palestinian question, meaning actual Palestinian statehood, if their leaders cozy up to Trump and just move forward as though this genocide didn't happen. Again, to reiterate, not expecting anything from the Sisis of the world or the Kingdom of Jordan. But on a domestic street level, the genocide has had a profound impact on people. And I think it's a wild card how the Arab street, so to speak, is going to respond to deals being made that cut out Palestine and don't recognize the fact that the United States and Israel conducted a genocidal operation for a year straight while their leaders remained overwhelmingly silent and without any real action.
And meanwhile, in the Trump administration, or the coming Trump administration, there's a much better organized faction of either isolationists or even kind of explicitly anti-neocons than there was in 2016. Because 2016, none of them really expected that they were even going into office, so they didn't even bother planning what they would do with power. But now, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump Jr., RFK Jr., like that kind of wing of the MAGA movement is pretty strongly anti-interventionist. And there was just a report this week that Marco Rubio, who is kind of gunning for and being floated for Secretary of State, is now being heavily internally opposed by RFK Jr., who has said he considers him too much of a war hawk and too tight with the neocons. At the same time, Mike Pompeo is working hard to maneuver himself back into the administration. I was at a Trump rally in Reading, Pennsylvania, on the day before the election, and Pompeo was at that. He didn't speak at it, notably, but he was there. And Trump kept talking about how handsome he looked because he's done something and he's lost like 100 pounds. And Trump went on and on about how incredible he looked, how great. He was so happy for him. He's like such a handsome man. And that matters to Trump. I think he's probably impressed that Pompeo turned it around. But there is a fear of the Tucker Carlson. He's up in that mix too. He's known to be an antagonist of Pompeo and his lot. So it's fluid and unpredictable situation. But Nosk, I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. But if not, Nosk, I know do you have something else?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like my other question was about where there's a faction of the left that is also sort of identifies with the isolationist tendency in the right, or at least it feels preferable in some ways to the hawkery. So I guess I've just been wondering, like, if there is any kind of possible role for pushing for, I don't know, any person who is like, I'm just wondering, like, where is the role of the left in this? It feels like there should be some, especially if things are in disarray, there should be some room to move certain appointees around, and if there's any discussion about that.
Yeah, I think the key thing is I don't think anybody is going to be taking advice from the left on who they ought to pick, but I think left-wing and non-aligned outlets like Dropsite have a role to play in having the freedom to just be able to come out and say the truth about somebody like a Brian Hook or somebody like a Mike Pompeo. If you are in the kind of conservative media ecosystem, you're not willing to take those shots because Pompeo might actually become Secretary of Defense or might go back and run the CIA again, and now you've crossed him, and he remains an extremely powerful figure. And even if he doesn't get it, he'll continue to have Trump's ear. And at the same time, the Pompeos of the world have enormous kind of donor connections, and so all of these kind of conservative outlets are very heavily reliant on massive amounts of dark money flowing their way, which can be then cut off instantly. And that's the problem with having your funding stream, flow from the same ecosystem of the politics that you cover, because then, if a powerful politician doesn't like your coverage of them, they know who your donors are and they can go to them and just shut them off. So us being completely divorced from that entire ecosystem, gives us a real freedom to be able to just report things and say things that will be very interesting to the kind of combatants in the internal fight, even if they're not going to take our advice on who they ought to put in office or put in positions of power. They'll certainly be interested, I think, in what we can dig up on people who are being floated for particular positions.
Well, and also, I think, Jessica, you could speak to this. There is also one of the left-right horseshoe issues is around kind of free trade, and where do you see the Trump administration going on that, and are there any opportunities there?
I think we're going to see a trade war that is worse than what we saw under Trump with the 2018 tariffs. So he used Section 301, and this is something that is a part of the 1974 Trade Act that was only used to settle disputes among our trade partners. No one used this to just impose taxes. So it's not so much that he imposed taxes, it's also how he did it. That's not a good trade partner. That's just all of a sudden going to pull the rug out from under you. And China's importing 60% of the world's soybeans. The U.S. was a huge seller of soybeans to China. China imposed retaliatory tariffs in response to Trump that led Chinese buyers to start getting soybeans from Brazil. So this really hurt U.S. farmers. We saw our exports nearly stop. We've seen the reduction of our sale of soybeans by the billions, the tens of billions. And so that's the kind of instability that could be produced under Trump. A lot of people are talking about, we're going to see prices go up. Yeah, of course we're going to see that too. We've already had the National Retail Federation say that companies are preparing to raise prices because of how erratic Trump is with this trade policy. We've seen him just raise tariffs on a whim before. So they have their quarterly reports and promises to shareholders. They don't want to have to take money out from their profits to cover the cost of these tariffs because, they're chained to Wall Street. And so they're going to push that cost on to consumers, of course. They're already preparing for that. What's interesting is in anticipation of Trump doing this once he's in office, there's a lot of manufacturers today that are making the decision to buy early while Biden is still in office. So I think we're going to see a lot of really tough decisions. There's some rumors that at manufacturing facilities, there's no Christmas bonuses because they're using all of the money to purchase imports. Walmart is one of the biggest people we think about because they get like 60 to 80% of their goods from China that they sell. But unfinished goods are a huge factor as well, and manufacturers want to import those before the price goes up tremendously. And so I think we're going to start to see people making decisions in anticipation of tariffs that have economic effects today. And then once they're imposed, we'll see prices additionally going up, but also the U.S. probably really hurt in the global economy. And so there is a case to be made for, free trade here or approaching this differently and seeing China, of course, as more of a partner than someone we should be competing with in this way.
Ryan, can I ask you, I want to ask you something about the bigger picture of what happened in this election, but just as a preface to it, if you look back at what's happened since 2000, when Bush rose to power, you had those 8 years of Obama. And then the Democratic Party shifted into this mode where it was like the machine was in total control. And, and as we look at what some of Trump's agenda is and recognize the fact that somehow, this man will have been in America's political life for 12 years. You had the 4 years of the presidency, and then you had the 4 years of him just constantly, campaigning. And now we're going to have another Trump presidency. It's astonishing to think that the Democrats created this reality. It just needs to be stated. And their pundits are all up in the blame game right now. And of course, you're starting to see the sniping at Biden become more public. For the way that he waited until the last second, and the fact that they had the kind of coronation of Kamala instead of an open primary process. But on a policy level, the Harris people decided it was a good idea to run to the right. And then, this totally unnecessary nonstop promotion of Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney at the expense of, just even minor alterations of the Gaza position, I think would have gone a long way. Remember, let's rewind back to when Harris was kind of coronated. The response from many Palestinians and Muslim and Arab organizations in the United States was, hold on a second, let's see what happens here. And she decided to come out at every rally and lead with, there were brutal rapes that happened. And to, when disrupted by
in Michigan, she went directly to Dearborn and said that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then sending that uber pervert Bill Clinton around to go and lecture, Muslims. It's utterly despicable the way that they ran this campaign. And I feel like, just as someone who doesn't want Donald Trump to be president, I'm just speaking as an individual American right now, I blame the Democrats for this. I blame for the way that they thrust Kamala on the electorate, the actions of the Biden administration, the way that the machine has conspired to just crush anything that they perceive to be the left. And then, run to the right, criticizing Trump for only building 2% of the border wall, sending out these surrogates that represent some of the worst excesses of American policy post 9/11, and then acting like, oh, it's the fault of Jill Stein, or it's the fault of Arab Americans, or oh, now it's going to be Latino men's fault. So what I'm asking you, Ryan, is like, what is the Democratic Party right now? Who is the leader of the Democratic Party right now?
I don't think. Well, Hakeem Jeffries, if anybody is.
What?
There is no leader of the Democratic Party right now.
I almost lost my mind at this Washington Post opinion piece yesterday about why this election is a rebuke for the left, and it was all about how Kamala Harris was actually like the coconut candidate that was like promoted by the left, like, and that there were many Democrats not on the left who were calling for an open convention or an open primary. I was like, I don't know a single person who was calling for that who wasn't on the left.
Right. Jamie Harrison's now trying to, on Bernie Sanders for his big statement saying, how dare you say that we've left behind the working class. Biden was the most pro-worker candidate and this and that. It's just there's no moment to listen and take feedback.
Yeah, and I think Biden was the most pro-worker president probably in my lifetime, and probably even stretching back to maybe even FDR. Now, it's a low bar. Biden, though, couldn't message any of that because he couldn't string a sentence together. He was also
and also that he managed to be the most pro-worker candidate by joining a picket line and by making some tweaks in the NLRB, but not by fundamentally changing any rules around power building in the movement.
Right, but small things in the right direction, and he did embrace a strong anti-corporate, anti-corporate power, antitrust agenda, and so that's
true.
But Biden didn't run for re-election because he had said he wouldn't. He had strongly implied he wouldn't, and then he tried, and then at the last minute foists Harris on the electorate, and that's where Tony West comes in. This is her brother-in-law, who also is the general counsel for Uber. One of the things that annoyed people the most about the inflation in 2021 and 2022 was Uber and Lyft prices went absolutely through the roof, and people had kind of budgeted this in and become dependent on Uber. They worked it into their habit of they're not taking trains and buses anymore. And now all of a sudden they've gone up by like 3 times. This is a problem of corporate power and corporate concentration. And Democrats started to call that sort of thing out. When they did, the Biden White House had their economists go out and say, actually, we don't have the data for that yet. It's the most classic Democratic economist thing you can possibly do. It turned out the data ended up being there for it. It was true. Jessica's talked about this a lot, that there was actually corporate basically conspiring to take advantage of the moment to raise prices. Companies like Uber and Lyft were the kinds of companies that were raising those prices. Kamala Harris, in her campaign, as she's got momentum, starts hammering corporate power and saying that what she's going to do differently is come after them and bring prices back down. She then abruptly stopped. And now we have the reporting to say that it was Tony West who told her to stop. And you not to put everything on Tony West, but he's emblematic of the Democratic Party. Like, why on earth is the Democratic Party, which once was a party of a multiracial working class, taking its advice from Uber's top lawyer about how to message about corporate pricing a month out from the election? And that's, I think, kind of it's just indicative of the entire problem that Democrats have. But Jessica, you had a video for us this week about how even though Democrats got shellacked, Democratic ideas, paid family leave, etc., triumphed in a lot of unusual places.
Yeah, I feel like we're always talking about this on the left, but it's just plain true that economically populist ideas are popular. Maybe people change their opinion when they're, a blue guy or red guy advocating for them. But what we saw was, in every single swing state, the margin was bigger. If Kamala got every single Jill Stein, Cornel West, Claudia De La Cruz voter to come over to her, she still would not have won. And so there's this blame game happening with the left when did the Democrats have their big victory? It was when Obama won in 2008, when he campaigned on very progressive ideas. And so we're seeing in states where Trump won by a significant margin, these ballot measures winning out. Nebraska being one of the examples where 57%, or rather over 70%, voted for paid sick leave. And then you have in Missouri where 57% voted to raise the minimum wage. And so if you just directly ask the same people that are casting a ballot for Trump what kind of economic policies they want, they're picking the economic populist policies, the ones that we call progressive. And it sucks because it's not new information. Data for Progress did really extensive surveys in swing states asking voters how they felt about eliminating medical debt, raising the federal minimum wage, capping rent, for example. And even Republicans in these swing states were overwhelmingly supportive. But what did we get from Kamala Harris? She said she was going to address the housing crisis by, yes, capping rent at 5% per year, but only for corporate landlords with 50 units or more. If you're in a rural area or in a small town, you say that's for someone in a big city, that's not going to help me out. Then the $25,000 in down payment assistance. Yes, that's good for first-time home buyers, but how much of the working class can save or even qualify for a home loan? And so I think they really failed to communicate what they had done for the economy and the working class of America, but also what the plan was going forward.
I mean, I'd like to ask you guys also, there's been a lot of chatter about how Trump gained in all these different sectors of American society, but when you look at the overall number, Trump in 2020 won 74 million votes. And this time around, there's still counting going on. It's just under 73 million. So he seems to have just held, actually, the same number. And the big difference is actually in the Democratic Party, where Biden got over 81 million, but Kamala Harris has something like over 68 million. So this massive drop. So it's not that he won, it's that they lost. And, what does that actually mean?
Well, I think we're going to have to wait until California finishes counting because they take weeks and weeks. And in the number, I haven't looked at it lately, but you could see twice as many votes coming out of California by the time we're done. And maybe there was something unique about 2020 in the way that, for one, everybody was home and mail-in balloting was everywhere. But two, Trump was in the White House, and I think the motivation to get him out from Democrats was clearly much stronger than it was to keep him out a second time. And and also, so many people 4 years later, I think, had nostalgia for the economy and were thinking to themselves, you know what, I was freaked out when he was elected, but he left. He tried not to leave. It was, people were literally dragged out kicking and screaming. But he did leave, and the price of eggs, food, gas was low. The mortgage interest rates were low. Unemployment was low. Things were better. Now mortgage interest rates are great high. Rent is high. Food prices are high. Even we're told that they're not rising as fast as they were, which is true, but they're still up. Gas prices are fluctuating wildly. There's all kinds of wars all over the place. And so I think people were able to look back and be like, well, if these are my choices, the guy's, a degenerate, but I liked my life better then. Now, I think that sets up a huge problem for Trump because I don't think he has any solution. It's obvious he has no solutions to any of those things. And I think scapegoating immigrants at Hollywood is not going to actually solve any problems. And I think eventually people will be like, well, wait, now all these bad things are happening under you.
Also with the caveat as well about the votes not being counted fully, I think one theme which may be prevalent is the failure of Kamala Harris to bring out the youth vote and the youth enthusiasm for her campaign. Because obviously in 2020, youth were a big part of pushing Biden over the top. And I think that, just to tie it back to where we started as well, too, foreign policy is not a major voting issue for Americans usually. But I think in this case, there was an opportunity to use this to help galvanize young people, because the one demographic of American society who really hates the war in Gaza are Gen Z, the younger people. And in 2020, the Democrats embraced an issue that they also cared about, which was police violence and racism, and made it something part of used it to galvanize that sort of youthful energy for support. And this time, the one issue that young people evinced interest in by polls, by their actions in schools and so forth, and protests, was something that the party very vocally rejected. So whatever energy you could have drawn upon, you ended up tuning it out. And this has been a running theme for the Democratic Party. They've been tuning out the voices of young people in their base since 2016, at least. I think that when we see the final numbers, it may be a theme to look into how much the failure to draw upon that same demographic, which is so important for Joe Biden.
Yeah, and of the young men who did show up, looks like Trump might have actually won them, which is a whole other podcast that we can have. Because I have
all the young men and Democrats were called Bernie Bros, and then they left.
Yeah,
so.
I have many thoughts about that, and Trump's embrace of the kind of manosphere, going on Theo Vaughn, going on all of these other kind of right coded but not really right podcasts that have kind of just drifted right over the last 10 years, or kind of been pushed right by a rejection of the left, by the left. Anyway, lots to talk about on that as well. Let's wrap it for now, though. Thank you guys all for doing this. Deconstructed is a production of Dropsite. This program was brought to you in part by a grant from The Intercept. This episode was produced by Jose Olivares. Go to dropsitenews.com, become a subscriber over there, join our free email list, become a paid subscriber, and for your podcasts, just search Dropsite News. I'm Ryan Grimm, co-founder of Dropsite. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Deconstructed wherever you listen to podcasts, and please leave us a rating and review. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.